distinguished speakers of the session. We have with us Ms. Galuzzo Giuseppina, who is the Green and Ethical Public Procurement Specialist, Presso, Italy, the Concept, Italy. Very warm welcome to you, ma'am. And we're also joined. Thank you so much. Very warm welcome to you once again. And may I also invite Ms. Bernardine Friends, who is the Head of Infrastructure Open Contracting Partnership, to the session. Very warm welcome to you. And we're also joined by Dr. Shelley Kiria, who is a Senior Fellow and Associate Director, Sustainability Development and Outreach Division, the Energy and Resources Institute. Terry, very warm welcome to you, ma'am, as well. As we begin with our presentations this evening, I would request all our panelists to keep up to their presentation for about 20 minutes. This will ensure us to have enough time for the question and answer session. Thank you for that. May I now invite our first panelist to make the presentation, but before I do so, I'd like to say a few words about you, ma'am. Ms. Galuzzo Giuseppina is the Senior Expert on Sustainability at Concept and trainer of executives and public authorities in the field of sustainability procurement, circular economy, and e-procurement tools, procedures. She supported the Ministry of Environment for the implementation of the Italian National Action Plan on GPP and participated in European projects on green and ethical public procurement. Very warm welcome to you, ma'am. And Ms. Galuzzo is going to speak on the international green procurement practices. Over to you, ma'am. Very warm welcome once again.
Thank you. I'm very glad to participate today at this important event with you. So I share my presentation. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you so much for the full screen. Thank you. We can see it.
Okay, so the European Union has been pushing member states for several years now to implement sustainability policies regarding to public procurement. The main objective of the European policies is to raise awareness about the advantages of sustainable procurement. Among the most important innovation of the European directives on procurement, we have the Copernican revolution of the EU criteria in public tenders, which include environmental and social aspects related to the subject of the contract. Also evaluating the most economically advantageous tender through the identification of the life cycle cost evaluation as a tool suitable for achieving the strategic objectives of a more efficient use of resources and the circular economy that promotes environment and employment, taking into account also externalities, and at least regulating the use of social and environmental certifications in public tenders. The Italian Contract Code has transposed the European directives and introduced an additional obligation for public administration, just Italians. The inclusion in their contract of the minimum environmental criteria, which is mandatory for all contracting authorities, regardless of the value of the contract. So, minimum environmental criteria are the reference point at national level for the use of GPP by contracting authorities. In 2013, Italy adopted the National Action Plan for GPP. The National Action Plan for GPP requires the Ministry of Environment, now Ministry of Ecological Transition, to set out the minimum environmental criteria for public procurement. These criteria, approved by ministerial decrees, have been published for 18 products, services, works groups, including buildings, vehicles, food and catering services, public lighting, and more. We can see after. In fact, they are mandatory environmental requirements defined within the tender procedure, which can be selection criteria, technical requirements, contractual clauses, and work criteria, aimed at selecting the best solution or product considering the environmental point of view. These criteria are defined as minimum because they are basic requirements in relation to the market offer, higher than the provision of the law, and they do not affect the ability of contracting authorities to introduce superior environmental requirements. So, under Article 34 of the Italian Public Contract Code, the inclusion in the project and in the tender documentation of technical specification and contractual clauses contained in the minimum environmental criteria is mandatory for all public tenders. But as you can see, award criteria are just taken into consideration for the application of the most economically advantageous tender. This is to ensure a gradual, softer application of the law, considering that these criteria are very, very technical and their use require an extra effort by both public buyers and enterprises whose goods and services must comply with the specification identified. This is the structure of Italian minimum environmental criteria that I've described to you. All criteria and requirements must be verified, so verification method is foreseen for each criteria. Getting even more specific, all the criteria envisaged by minimum environmental criteria are defined after an analysis of production processes, characteristics of products and materials, and of course the needs, with an approach that takes into consideration the impact on the environment of a product, service, work along this life, the life cycle from birth to grave. Sometimes the major impacts on which we can intervene concern the performance of the service, for example, energy efficiency. Other times, the production process or eco-design requirements, including packaging of the product. Sometimes, minimum environmental criteria promote the use of a service instead of supply. For example, this is the case of printers. Below are some examples of reducing environmental impacts related to the use of specific minimum environmental criteria. We have environmental goals to achieve as energy saving and reduction of CO2 emissions, circular economy, reduction of hazardous substances, safeguarding biodiversity, fight against deforestation. And we have the list of minimum criteria whose contributes to the achievement of those objectives. Criteria for, so we have criteria for computers, printers, energy services for buildings, furniture, print and copy cartridges, paper, cleaning services, detergents, textiles, catering services, supply of foodstuffs, parks and garden maintenance, urban waste management service, or buildings. Here it is an easy example of using a minimal environmental criteria for purchasing recycled copy and graphic paper. A mandatory technical requirement is the paper must be made up of 70% recycled cellulose fibers, and virgin fibers used must come from responsibly managed forests or controlled sources. there is a discretionary award criteria. That is, scores are assigned in proportion to the offers of paper made up of higher percentage of post-consumer recycled cellulose fiber. And then there is the verification methods that suppliers has to submit to public administrations. And as you can see, the verification methods can be an ISO Type 1 environmental label certification as a European Ecolabel or the Blaue Länger Ecolabel or others, with the indication of the percentage of recycled, or a certification issued by a recognized organization, or a technical documentation for the manufacturer with the supporting documents attached. As you can see, the possession of an environmental label is required, but the equivalence of other testing procedures is also guaranteed by defining alternative methods. Now I will talk about my company and the work we have been doing for many years in the field of GPP. Consip is a public stock company owned by the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. Consip missions is to make the use of public resources more efficient and transparent by providing tools and skills to public administrations in order to allow them to perform public purchases and at the same time stimulate a competitive participation of enterprises to public tenders. Consip's activities involve main areas as the implementation of the program for the rationalization of public spending on goods and services through the use of ICT and innovative procurement tools. That there are framework contracts, e-marketplace for public administration, framework agreements, and dynamic purchasing system. Today, I will show you an example of the activity of Consip as a central purchasing body with the role of contracting authority. The use of framework contracts and framework agreements awarded by Consip is mandatory for Italian public administration, with some exception. So, framework contracts are awarded through Consip after an online economic and technical evaluation. And each framework contract has certain parameters that are instructed to this structure. The main good or service awarded, framework contract duration, maximum allowed quantities, and good service characteristics, which take into account the environmental and social aspects were contemplated. Consip manages all stages of the purchase procedure. So you can see feasibility study and definition of procurement strategy, supplier selection and contract award, framework contract management, service level monitoring. For public administration, there are many advantages in using the contract awarded by Consip. First, the simplification of the purchasing process, better supply quality that also contribute to the National Green Public Procurement Project, reduction of legal costs tied to procedure litigation, which are paid for by Consip, compliance with the law, and also monitoring is ensured. I'm going to define the tender design. The following steps are adopted to include the GPP in every purchase procedure, and I will briefly explain them one by one to you. First step for us is the legislation analysis regarding minimum environmental criteria or European directives. We have many to consider, such as Clean Vehicles Directive, Waste Directive, Energy Labeling Directive, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And we analyze eco-label, standard ISO, and technical legislation which can be applied to the product category subject to the tender or service. Even in cases where there is no legal obligation in the use of GPP, we consider the sustainable aspects before defining the characteristics of the contract, asking us questions such as which environmental impacts are more relevant, what aspects to give priority to, and using scientific information available on the subject and studying best practices of other procurers along Europe or along the world. The second step is the e-market analysis through questionnaires and meetings with suppliers, in which we ask, for example, if their organization is committed to social accountability, or if they have planned internal energy efficiency policies, depend on the subject of the contract. The first step is the identification of green criteria to be included in the tender, defined by full description of environmental characteristics required, quality standards followed to identify technical or functional specifications, testing procedure, evaluation of economic and environmental benefits related to the scoring rule. Only after the award of the tender, we can make an evaluation of the results of the green action carried out. And in the next edition of the tender, we can improve, for example, an environmental criteria introduced in the first edition of the tender. The fourth step is also important, and it consists in identifying the value of the green action that must be communicated to the public administration that procure goods or services through the contracts awarded by CONSIP. The value can consist in better functional performance, or lower energy consumption, or longer lifetime of the product. From 2015 to 2019, almost 19 billion of euros of green purchases have been awarded through CONSIP. And then we communicate with public administration with the green action through this symbol, the tree. So they can easily know if there is a green purchase or not. To give two basic examples of what a central purchasing body can achieve awarding a tender procedure with green characteristics, I have chosen a tender observer in which, using as minimum criteria of energy efficiency and as awarding criteria the more reduction in service consumption compared to the minimum values of Energy Star label requirements, can get 1,000 and 700 of tons of CO2 are avoided per year. And in the following example, instead, a comparison is made between the concept contract for laptop 11 and laptop 12. As you can see, laptop 12's framework contract, considering the same number of laptop replaced, the same kilowatt cost, and the same years of life cycle, leads to savings in consumption and generates 2 million euros savings per year, corresponding to 5,000 tons of CO2 emissions avoided, thanks to the supply of more efficient laptops than the minimum energy storage requirement. It is very satisfying to carry out this type of analysis, which, however, requires a lot of investment in terms of time and resources. Thanks for the attention. For me, the subject is exciting, and I've tried to give you a lot of information in the shortest possible time, but I'm always available for further information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, ma'am. We now move to our next speaker. May I request Ms. Bernadine Ferns, who is the head of Infrastructure Open Contracting Partnership, to make a presentation. But before I do so, may I say a few words about you, ma'am. Bernadine is the global head of the Infrastructure and Regional Head of Asia Pacific at the Open Contracting Partnership. Before joining OCP, she was Associate Director and Regional Manager for Latin America and Southeast Asia at COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. She began her development career at Deloitte & Touche, working on mega infrastructure projects before further specializing in climate governance at the Overseas Development Institute. A barrister by trade, she has over 20 years of experience across the legal, consulting, and international development sectors. Very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Can you?
Yes,
is that good?
We can
Perfect.
see your screen. If you could just make it full screen.
There you go. Are we good?
Oh, we're still awaiting. Now it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to this important event. It's such a delight to be here. So I really appreciate the invitation. And thank you for that wonderful introduction as well. So I'm Ben Ferns. I'm the Global Head of Infrastructure here at the Open Contracting Partnership. I'm also the Regional Head of Asia and the Pacific. And so today I've been asked to talk to you about how open contracting can help drive green and sustainable procurement. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to give you a quick introduction on what open contracting is all about. I'll talk a little bit about green procurement versus sustainable procurement and what those differences are. And then I'll give you some examples of how open contracting has been applied and implemented around the world and what we can do with it. So first of all, open contracting is a global norm. It's been endorsed by the G7, the G20, the OECD through various forums, including the G20 anti-corruption, open data principles, the integrity in public procurement, high-level principles, compendium for good practices. We're just about to launch the G20 Smart Cities Alliance open contracting model policy as well in a week. So there's lots going on with various partners of ours. We're also an Open Government Partnership or OGP norm. There are over 189 open contracting commitments in national action plans all around the world now. And of course, we also complement sister initiatives like EITI, the Beneficial Ownership Status Standards, Cost Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, and many others. So what is open contracting and who is the Open Contracting Partnership? So the Open Contracting Partnership, or OCP, we work with governments, businesses, civil society to transform public procurement to deliver better goods, services, and public works for everyone. And open contracting is all about publishing and using open data on public procurement to help all stakeholders identify and fix problems in the way that public money is spent. So we target the entire value chain of public procurement. That's planning, tendering, awards, implementation, right through to delivery, completion of those contracts. And using the power of open data and combined with effective participatory mechanisms, we've helped to reduce corruption, improve efficiency, enhance competition, build credibility and trust, and deliver better value for money. Now, increasingly in the work that we do, we're being asked to help transform public procurement into sustainable procurement. But what does that mean? Often terms like sustainable procurement, green procurement, ethical procurement, inclusive procurement, ethical procurement, they're all used interchangeably. But although they're linked, they can be very different. Now, if you look on the bottom left-hand side of this Venn diagram, where it says planet, you'll see that green procurement is really about procuring goods, services, and public works in a way that is climate friendly or environmentally responsible. And depending on who you ask, what is environmentally responsible can also vary considerably. So it could mean, for example, reducing energy consumption or emissions, so by introducing motion sensor lights or taps. Or it could mean responsible waste disposal by recycling or reducing waste in the production process. Now, socially responsible procurement at the top of the Venn diagram is about procuring goods, services, and public works in a way that achieves better social impacts or outcomes. So either, for example, reduce poverty, improved health outcomes, which has been so important, especially during in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. But it's really about how it serves people better. And then on the bottom right-hand side, you've got what's sometimes called inclusive procurement. So that's procurement that can help improve economic growth or prosperity outcomes. So, for example, through job creation or creating business opportunities for SMEs or MSMEs, for example. Now, you'll see from this diagram that sustainable procurement sits at the intersection of people, planet, and prosperity, where you have public procurement that delivers for the environment, the economy, and society. And what's important to say is that although we should aspire to it, it may not always be possible to hit this intersection of people, planet, and prosperity each and every time. So sometimes trade-offs have to be made and decisions have to be made on what you're actually going to target. And what this means is that we need to be very clear about what our goals are and how we communicate successes, because otherwise we risk greenwashing, which means creating a false or misleading impression about how green you are when actually you might not be very green, or how sustainable you are when actually you might not be very sustainable. So in this example, I think it's from Greenpeace, you'll see that particularly for large oil and gas, the BP and others like it have rebranded itself as green, but fossil fuels still supply 84% of the world's energy, and only 5% of that is from renewables. So the question is, can you really call yourself green if the majority of your energy production is really from polluting oil and gas? So consider this also. Is it really green if you have energy efficient computers, but energy inefficient buildings? Or if you have energy efficient buildings, but deforested vast tracts of rainforest to build that building? Is it really green if you recycle paper, but dump toxic waste into rivers and streams? So these are all things that you might have to think about in terms of what is actually green, what is actually sustainable, and bearing in mind that even if something is green, it might not be sustainable. So let's think back to this Venn diagram that I showed you earlier. Have you hit each and every element for people, planet, and prosperity? So with all that being said, what can we do about it? Well, this is where open contracting can help. So our starting point for our work with open contracting is to do with standardized, structured, machine-readable open data. And the value of this type of data is that it can help you assess and measure exactly how green or how sustainable your public procurement really is. And so we've developed the Green Flags for Procurement Guide, which helps you use open data to track and measure the adoption of green public procurement. Now you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, it's an example from Lithuania, who have committed to making its procurement 100% green from 2023. And earlier we saw from Giuseppina all the various different ways for which you can have green criteria. And similarly, in Lithuania, procurement is green if, for example, you use specific eco-labels or specific products that have been pre-approved by the Ministry of Environment. Now, what they've been able to do using the power of open data through this dashboard, for example, is to understand, first of all, what is the value of green public procurement and what the procedures are over the last 3 years. You can filter according to buyer, supplier, item category, for example, and you can measure how many of them have some sort of green criteria. So that means you can understand how green your public procurement actually is. So I think this is a really great start. But we have to be really careful because, as I said before, having some sort of green criteria doesn't necessarily mean that your entire procurement value chain is fully green or sustainable. So what else can we do then? This is a starting point. Now, the other important thing and the other useful thing about standardized machine-readable open data, and we have a number of open data standards that can help with that, is that you can join up procurement data with other data sets. And with that, you get more utility and it helps you to understand what is actually going on. So in this example, this is an example from Honduras. It's a prototype called Infrast, developed with our friends COS, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. And it's a user-friendly tool. It joins up public procurement data with different data sets to help understand environmental risk. So you see in this this analytics dashboard, that it includes a kind of a red flags map. And in this early concept phase, Infrast shows what infrastructure projects have been submitted for planning and what environmental licenses they have, or that they don't have, but they should have, and what the environmental regulation requirements are, and what the environmental impact assessments say and whether they've been disclosed or not. So you can see whether or not projects have the right environmental licenses, whether they comply with the environmental regulations, or whether they have the right environmental impact assessments. And so what that means is that before projects are actually approved, government decision makers can easily check whether the project should have the right requirements and whether they can go ahead. So you nip things in the bud at the early planning stage itself. Now, in this next example, it's one from Taiwan, where our partners on the ground joined up public procurement data with on flood infrastructure, so flood barriers, sluice gates, things like that, with environmental data, so specifically flood data. So where are floods happening, where are they the most severe? And so you can see whether public investment on flood defense infrastructure matches the environmental need. So you see what you want is to see on the top right corner and the purple, where there are lots of floods and lots of spending, and on the bottom left corner where there are few floods and less spending. But you can see from this map already that there's some discrepancies here. So in the top left, for example, where there are only a few floods but lots of spending, but on the bottom right where there are a lot of floods but much less spending. So this helps you to make sense of public spending and whether or not it's giving people the things that they actually need. And our partners in India, Civic Data Lab, are now taking this model one step further, and they're adding an additional data overlay to it to track for social impact. So they're looking at vulnerability indicators, poverty indicators, other socioeconomic indicators, because we know that the poorest and most vulnerable people suffer the most from natural disasters. So you might be able to then make even more sense of this type of analysis. So for example, you might see in the pink areas where there's a lot of floods but less spending, it may be because there's nobody living there. And so that makes sense. So that's one of the ways where you can see how public money is being spent and whether or not it's delivering for environmental safeguards, environmental protections, but also social outcomes and improved social outcomes. Similarly, in this next slide, Okay. Similarly, in this next slide, this is an example from Malaysia where they joined up infrastructure planning and procurement data for schools and hospitals and cross-referenced that with capacity and needs data. So they looked at things like how many hospitals there are in a specific area, what is the ratio of hospital beds to patients, doctors to patients, and similarly for schools, the number of desks to students, teachers to students, and things like that. And the idea was to try and understand whether or not certain areas were already oversaturated with infrastructure, and so that public funds could be focused on those areas that needed it the most, where there were fewer schools and fewer hospitals, but where demand was high, so that you don't get a case of building schools in an area that then sit empty or lie empty because there aren't enough students to attend that school, for example. So that's another way in which you can join up procurement data to deliver more targeted and improve social impact. And now in this next slide, this is again an example from India, where again, our partner Civic Data Lab had mapped public procurement data to the Sustainable Development Goals in Himachal Pradesh. So here you can see whether or not public procurement and the money that's being spent through public contracts is actually advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in this case, it was health and water and sanitation. And they also developed a health procurement index that can show analysis with report cards right down to the district level that show how each district is performing on the SDGs. And in this next example, it's one of my favorites. Our partners have joined up public procurement data for maternal and child health and cross-reference that with infant mortality rates. And so immediately you can see that generally speaking, where public procurement spend on maternal and child health is high, so for example, in like labor units or wards, infant mortality rates tend to be low. And where investment in maternal and child health is low, then infant mortality rates tend to be high. So again, this is just another one of many examples of how you can use data to better understand how procurement is performed for you. Now, some exciting news coming up next is that we're also working on many new projects. I talked a little bit at the start about how you can measure how green your public procurement is with our Green Flags guidance. And we're now working with various partners to help them operationalize some of the great work that they've already done so that they can use data to deliver on broader goals. So for example, environmental goals, conservation goals. So in this slide, you'll see that we're working with WWF to develop some guidance on how open data in public infrastructure, planning, procurement, and delivery can help to improve environmental and conservation outcomes. So we're looking really at the intersection of infrastructure, corruption, conservation particularly, and we're going to develop a series of targeted indicators that can help stakeholders to analyze data and infrastructure projects and contracts, and that can help them to identify the potential environmental and conservation risks. And we're also working on a sustainable procurement guidance, which should be published anytime soon. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like there's so much to discuss on this topic, which I'm very excited by, eager to take questions and answer any questions that you may have. I know that this is a new topic for many of you, so please do feel free to ask questions. We're really, really excited to discuss it with you. And with that, I hand it over to the chairperson.
May I now invite Ms. Shelley Keria, who is a Senior Fellow and Associate Director at Sustainability Development and Outreach Division, the Energy and Resource Institute, TERI. Dr. Shelley Keria is a policy researcher who is a Senior Fellow and Associate Director, as mentioned, with the Sustainability Development Outreach Division at TERI. She has pioneered the concept of green budgeting and has majorly focused on sustainable development and climate change related policy research. She is a board member of World Sustainability Development Forum and was member of the task force on greening rural development of the Ministry of Rural Development. She is a Doctor of Philosophy in International Studies, Masters of Business Administration, and Bachelor of Engineering. Very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Over to you now.
Yeah, I'd just like to confirm if you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see your slide. If you could just make it full screen in the slide mode.
Has it come already?
Not yet.
Now?
Not yet. But that's okay, maybe we can continue.
Uh, good afternoon to all of you. I just want to just confirm once more, whether you can see.
Yes,
in full
we
screen?
could see, but it's still not in the full screen mode. Do you want us to play it for you? We could do it from our team. Ima can do it for you.
Okay, yeah, if that's possible, because it's
Yeah?
going to be like
Okay.
very difficult to read the text.
The slide. Can you see the slide now?
All right. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this important event on a topic which certainly deserves a lot more attention than it is getting presently. And next slide. In terms of sustainable public procurement, we know that there are many definitions on sustainable public procurement. So, and a lot of these definitions come from the United Nations Environment Program and also organizations like IISD. From the context of India, sustainable public procurement can be defined as a tool whereby the public sector meets its need for goods and services while contributing to the three pillars of sustainable development through inclusive growth, promotion of livelihoods, and through life cycle based approaches to decision making while procuring their goods and services. We all know that target 12.7 is specifically on promoting public procurement practices that are sustainable and in accordance with national policies and priorities. And sustainable development, as all of you know, was adopted by all member states in 2015 at the UN Sustainable Development Summit. But responsible consumption and production, or sustainable consumption and production, has been around in policy discussions for much longer than that. At the global level, it was very core to the Marrakesh process and then also to the 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption and production, which was adopted at Rio Plus 20. And sustainable public procurement is one of the key or one of the 5 initial programs of the 10-year framework program. Next slide, please. So sustainable public procurement, why does it matter in India? Well, of course, firstly, estimates do differ, but according to one number which was presented at the task force on sustainable public procurement constituted by the Ministry of Finance in Government of India, the spending by government or public sectors, and this includes the national, state level governments, as well as the public sector enterprises, could be as much as 25% of GDP. And this is really like a lot of amount. Also, public procurement in India can also be seen as a medium to achieve various social objectives. India is a developing country and is on its growth path and would need to have also focus on economic growth while also looking at social objectives. Public procurement can also be seen as a means to boost markets and also including micro, small and medium enterprises, which are in huge number in India. At the same time, if India were to see itself as a global player and has and wants to be competitive in international markets, having products and promoting products and services that meet the best international standard would be in its best national interest, so as to stay competitive in international markets. Next slide, please. Now, what is the policy landscape on sustainable public procurement in India? First and foremost, I mean, the social pillar, and this was also mentioned very clearly by my previous presenter on the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. The first focus on public procurement in India has been on the micro, small and medium enterprises, or rather on the micro and small medium enterprises, which are the more smaller player within the larger MSME sector. And wherein in 2012, an executive order was passed by the Ministry of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises, whereby directing every central government department to procure a minimum of 20% of their goods and services from micro and small medium enterprises. And this target subsequently increased to 25%. If we were to look at the latest data for the financial year 2021-22, which ended, which is going to end this year, but the latest data so far is basically, which basically says that at the moment, about 32.63% of total procurement by central agencies alone have been from MSCs. And next slide, please. Firstly, the national environment policy in the context of the green part of sustainable public procurement, the first mention was in 2006 National Environment Policy of 2006, wherein the Environment Ministry explicitly mandated the public sector to encourage adoption of purchase preference of goods and services that meet the highest international standards. And following with some government or some public sector entities, including the Ministry of Railways, they did start internalizing environmental and at least energy efficiency criteria in their procurement decision. For example, in 2014, the Ministry of Railways also joined the 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption and production. Also, the other important aspect is the Government of India allocation of business rules, which basically, in the interest of transparency and to promote a more digital world, mandates that all the procurement has to be done digitally through the National Public Procurement Portal or the Government e-marketplace. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the policy landscape on sustainable public procurement is the General Financial Rules of 2017, which basically lays down the process related to public procurement in India. And when we were to look at rule number 144 of the General Financial Rules, it does give the freedom for a procurer to set its own standards and comply by international standards. And so one important point on this particular aspect is to have in place, the whole process of standards, labelings, as well as certification, and that be adopted at a very large scale. It's only then when can the markets function on information. Can that information be available for about goods and services? The other important initiative in India was the Task Force on Sustainable Public Procurement, wherein the Ministry of Finance did constitute a task force on sustainable public procurement. And next slide, please. Quite apart from that, one of the other important aspect related to sustainable public procurement is eco-labels and certification schemes in India. And there are many that are there in India, which includes the Zero Effect, Zero Defect scheme, which includes the Eco-Mark scheme of the Ministry of Environment Forest, the star labeling by BEE, the organic certification scheme by the Ministry of Environment Forest, and the various quality schemes, as per the Bureau of Indian Standards, which are in line with the International Standard Organization, and also includes schemes related to environment and energy efficiency. And what we see is that while in India, there are initiatives by individual ministries such as the Ministry of Railways or some public sector enterprises, it is not really there in the sense like there is no single national action plan on sustainable public procurement. While it can be argued that the General Financial Rule by the Ministry of Finance does have broader provisions wherein ministries can actually define their own criteria as far as their standards which they feel fit. But then again, what one sees is lacking is a sort of a national and overarching framework. Next slide, please. So overall, what one sees from the policy landscape is that sustainable public procurement in India has 4 dimensions. One is the socio-economic dimension, and one can see the executive order by the Ministry of Micro, Small, Medium Enterprises has had has had good results, and the procurement from micro and small enterprises has grown over the years. The second part, which is still under development, is the environmental pillar, and to some extent it has been successful in terms of procuring electrical appliances such as air conditioners, but then this particular aspect can be expanded to more product categories. The third important aspect is the digitization of procurement itself, which one can see that it is an opportunity, because if information and environmental information about products and products and services that were procured was made available through the electronic through digital means, this could perhaps could enable sustainable public procurement. And the fourth important dimension is the information itself, because markets do function on information, and this is through various standards, labels, as well as certification, which are there in India. Next slide, please. So let's just come to the fourth dimension, which is very important. And like I said, that markets do function on information. So when one looks at Z certification, and this is a relatively newer certification scheme, at the moment it has shown limited uptake. And while the latest data was not available while I was checking for it today, but in January 2020, out of the 23,000 MSMEs who had registered themselves, only about 304 MSMEs were certified. Even when one goes about looking at the latest annual report available on the ministry's website, that the fund utilization for the Z scheme was just 5.5%. So which just basically indicates that then there's so much that can be done if one were to look at it as an opportunity under the Z scheme. And if the government has a focus on procuring from MSMEs or MSEs, there is so much that can be done in this particular sector. Next slide, please. Moreover, there is a participatory guarantee system. Now, this is for organic produce from agriculture sector. Again, there is this particular certification system, but is it integrated when one looks at procurement systems? But this is just one example. Then when one looks at eco labels such as eco marks, this has been in India for a while now, since '91. And India was one of the earlier countries to adopt this, ahead of the Rio summit. But then again, the question then remains, are these certificates part of the procurement system, which is the government e-marketplace or the central public procurement portal? Next slide, please. So just to look at some figures as to what are the products procured by categories. So this is just information from the government e-marketplace. So one can see, and this is by monetary value, just like to say this is not by quantity or number of units, that vehicles constitute 45% of public goods procured, followed by computers. So then that shows that there is again there's a lot of scope in these products. And fortunately, laws in India have been towards promoting more energy efficient vehicles, more electric vehicles, as well as categories of electronic devices which meet energy efficiency standards. But what if one were to look at a life cycle based approach, one should not just stop at procuring the product, but also ensure that while one is procuring a product, there is an ecosystem in place that also enables buyback and extended producer responsibility. If you just look at the highest two categories, 45 and 30%, 75%, that is literally 75% of what is being procured by the government. This itself, kind of presents you with a huge opportunity, And even for these two categories, if there was, EPR properly in place, and it's not just that if one were to look at the life cycle based approach, the responsibility should not just end at procuring, but also ensuring the end of life management of these products. And if you were to just look at the top 75% of the category, the potential there is also huge, not to mention other categories like paper. While these may be small monetary wise, but in terms of quantity and in terms of the livelihoods impacted, these are huge as well. Furniture, plastic, so so all these categories, a good opportunity and a wave, sort of, what makes one more optimistic is there are lots of policies in place by the government of India. How it finds its place in procurement or purchasing decision is the next step. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of services, again, these are all calculated estimates because there are many categories, and so one had to aggregate these. But when one looks at vehicle hiring, in city hiring being electric vehicle, there is a huge potential in that as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. So all in all, what one can say is that there is a need for life cycle based approaches to SCP and SPP. And even when one is talking about sustainable public procurement, one must not just stop at procuring, but also, what is to be done with that product, at the end of life. And what we saw in terms of the categories that is purchased, there are a fair amount of products that are purchased which need a proper end of life management. Next slide, please. So what are the barriers? So this is from one of our study, and incidentally, Rennie, who is chairing, was a part of it because it was from the paid study. And we did have a dedicated chapter on sustainable public procurement. So in terms of policy gaps, we did feel that while there were existing provisions were there that allowed flexibility to enable sustainable public procurement, but still there is a need for a macro framework for in terms of an action plan, as well as monitoring and reporting, including through SDGs. There is still insufficient market information in terms of labeling, which can be better integrated in existing procurement systems. As well as there is a high perceived cost of sustainable goods still. So, so because a lot of the government departments still went by the typical tendering process of L1, so this concern did come up because there's just like a higher perceived cost of sustainable public procurement or sustainable goods. Next slide, please. In terms of opportunities, so while there are the rule, specifically the rule 144 of the general financial rules could be extended to products, and the criteria such as environment can be listed by the procuring agency, but there is a need for an overarching framework, including for not just central ministries, but public sector units, states, as well as cities and municipalities. And this recommendation we very clearly gave in one of our exercises on the National Indicator Framework on SDG 12, to have this kind of a monitoring and reporting framework in place. Again, there is a need to address lack of market information. While India does have many standards, certification, labels in place, these need massive upscaling and adoption, as well as integrated with market mechanisms and procurement systems. Again, there is a need for spreading greater awareness on sustainable public procurement to address the perceived high costs of sustainable public procurement. And again, this is again an area where where there is a need to address that that lack of or that insufficient understanding. And next slide. So yeah, that's all. I'd just like to conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. May I now invite you, sir, to share your presentation, and it shall be followed by concluding remarks from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I do apologize as a session chair running late is not the right example, but I was unfortunately called away. Thank you for taking that over as a master of ceremony and indeed listening into the previous discussions. Thank you very much to EMA and the World Bank for putting together this procurement summit, because procurement is an important component. As Shelley was saying, 25% of procurement of GDP is spent on procurement. So it's an important sector of the economy in that sense. So congratulations also on including green procurement or sustainable public procurement, because that's very much the needed item of the agenda, the need of the day to drive the sustainable development goals, to drive the transition to zero carbon growth, a zero carbon future that also India and many other countries have now committed to with the COP26, with the Glasgow commitments. So UNIDO is pleased to associate with the summit, and I was asked to, in addition to chair in this session, to also present a little bit of a perspective from an industrial development organization. So not so much a public policy perspective, but how can this public procurement act as a catalyst for industrial change or for industrial transformations? So for those who are not so familiar with UNIDO, let me spend 2 minutes on this. UNIDO is the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. We are specialized UN agency that supports developing country member states to industrialize. So we're a specialized agency like the ILO, the World Health Organization, and so on. We have 50 plus or 55 years of technical cooperation in India, particularly in support of MSME development, but also in other countries, because this is a global initiative. So we work across the developing world and the economies in transition. Our mandate is linked to SDG 9, which talks about building resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. And that is basically looking at the 3 pillars of industrial development. That is, industrial development is aimed to advance economic competitiveness, to create shared prosperity, the social dimension, and to also secure environmental sustainability. But these are quite abstract terms. So I'd like to say that we are basically trying to work for industrialization and making sure that industrialization works for markets. So we have products and services that are sought after in the market, that people are prepared to pay a price for, that are of good quality and safe to people, that the workplaces are safe and decent, and that also we respect and operate within environment and sustainability boundaries and climate boundaries. So under this, with the government of India, we have what we call the Facility for International Cooperation on Inclusive and Sustainable Industrial Development, FIC-ICID. It's a very long name, but it's essentially a partnership under which we work also with EMA and with other initiatives with the government of India through the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade to promote partnerships and knowledge and learning on inclusive and sustainable industrial development. And that covers then a wide array of topics, circularity, low carbon economy and manufacturing excellence, digitalization and the fourth industrial revolution, and the power of data that the second last speaker was talking about. So many topics which are there. But this as a maybe a bit of a background to contextualize where I come from. And I think Shaili has already given a definition of sustainable public procurement, and we can go in different ways around this. But I mean, it's essentially a process. So I would say it's more a process of looking at how public authorities, whether it's in the health sector and the public works or infrastructure, purchase goods, services, and works with reduced environmental and social impacts throughout the life cycle by comparing in there. And this is very strongly anchored in SDG 12 or the target 12.7, promote public procurement practices. But I would also say, and that's maybe less emphasized, this is also meant to contribute to the other SDGs. And the SDGs, as many have said, they are an integrated part, so none is separable. So I think in particularly sustainable public procurement should contribute to affordable and clean energy, the energy infrastructure, and then to industry and innovation and infrastructure, and also to the sustainable cities and communities. Think about the social housing, the housing infrastructure, the build stock that's being built. So these are really areas where a lot of government spending goes, and where government spending can make a difference towards a low carbon future and an inclusive and sustainable development. So there is quite a lot of experience now, and I think sustainable public procurement has been spoken about for the best part of the last 20 years. And if you look at UNEP has put this guidance together, there's no rocket science in there. So they say it started with getting started, commitment, planning, and implementation. So I will not emphasize on this, but I would like to just highlight what is then the key aspect, and Shelley sort of also referred to that. That is then trying to focus on which products are to be included, or which services or which works are to be included. And that's typically a kind of an analysis of the market, like Shelley showed that 40% or so is spent on vehicles of procurement, and also then the prioritization on basis of environmental impact. So there is this important element of prioritizing products and services for sustainable public procurement. And if we then look at some of the areas which globally, and this comes out of the SDG 12.7 monitor, what do we see, which programs are focusing on? You see that the typical culprits or target areas are office IT, so there's computers, printers, scanners, office paper and stationery, vehicles, cleaning services from a perspective of water use and the chemicals being used, furniture in terms of the wood and other things, the building design with less building equipment is air conditioners as well, building materials, energy, and also textiles which are being used. So you see that it is largely, I would say, maybe one might say it's more focused on consumer goods, which governments buys in large quantities, but which are also used by consumers and by schools, by other entities and by businesses in that sense. So there is a lot has been said about the benefits of sustainable public procurement. So if I go to the summary publication of UNEP, then they list out 10 benefits. And I think I would like to zoom in on this element of fostering innovation, the seventh one, which you can also see on the staircase there in the infographic, but it's a bit small. But I think that there are sort of inherent barriers in the sustainable public procurement practices that are trying to work against it. So we're looking for sufficient competition in the market for the alternative product. We are looking for established markets and so on. And these tend to be in a limit or a limiting market entrance for the manufacturers of environmental goods and services. And this is of concern. This is of concern for UNIDO as we see that. So if I put it slightly different, so from a UNIDO perspective, I think that sustainable public procurement should basically deal with 4 objectives and four targets. So it should be, first of all, and that's of course within the context of this procurement summit, most important, that we get cost-effective procurement of quality goods, services, and work. So it should not be compromising on the quality of services that can be delivered to the citizens. And then, of course, we are looking at reducing the environmental social impact of government activities and public works. So we want energy efficient air conditions, so there's less energy use in government activities. But then, and that is perhaps what is less emphasized in the sort of public policy on sustainable public procurement coming from an environmental domain, is that we of course also want to transform markets for sustainable products and services. So we want to make it with the sustainable public procurement, we want others to also buy many more of these preferred goods and services. And as a fourth component, I think that we would also like to drive the clean energy and materials transition. So how can this public procurement then also drive sector transformations also in hard to abate sectors? So we're looking at maybe at a bit more forward looking on how procurement can help in that. And then I think that it might be fair to say that the further you go down, the larger the impact might actually be of the dollar spent in terms of achieving environmental and social benefits. So if we drill down a bit further on saying what is transforming markets for sustainable products and services, and then we can take a look at how energy efficiency has been market transformation, and that is a little bit or you could summarize, I think, pretty much around the categories of de-risk, economize, and finance. So de-risk is that we standardize products so that not everybody separately has to figure out what's the best product, but we have kind of standardized it, and therefore we de-risk it for individual buyer or for government procurer what the preferred good is, and then we economize by basically bulk procurement. So we bulk procure fans so that somebody can manufacture many energy efficient fans at a competitive price. And then ultimately we look also at finance to, in the energy domain, it's then energy service contracts or renewable energy service contracts, but it can also be expanded to other areas. We can also do performance-based contracting for cleaning services or other elements. So that is kind of the traditional areas if I talk about market transformations. So if I take just a perspective of what UNIDO works, and I put there 2 programs that we work on, Facility for Low Carbon Technology Deployment and Clean Tech Program. So we try to help as an industrial development organization, companies to develop and find the goods and services, so products which can help there. And then you see that typical is then you have an idea, you go to a prototype, you accelerate is in an investor value to start up, and then you run an enterprise. And you could say that the first part is focusing on the product value and the later part is on the business value. So we have different challenge and accelerator programs. And these have, if I just look at India as just a few examples, these have resulted in products which could well be within the domain of public procurement. So you see there the solar ferry, which was developed for Navalt in Cochin running, that the energy efficient ceiling fans, so a very common product, but it runs on 40% of the energy of a normal ceiling fans, and there's millions of ceiling fans running in India. Then the third one is the cooking stove, which runs on 30% less gas. And then the fourth one is some of the pumps in there. So I think that there are these kind of products which are not necessarily regarded with the sustainable public procurement perspectives, but the manufacturers and the designers, the startups of these companies that are developing these products typically cannot meet the procurement standards because they don't have 3 years in business or they don't have a sufficient market share. But these are the ones that could bring a transformation in the market and could really make a difference. So the challenge is a bit to bring those newer innovations also into the sustainable public procurement. So let me then also zoom in the second part, and maybe on something which UNIDO is also quite keen on. There is what I would say is the public works opportunity. So government are the top purchasers of steel, cement, and concrete for public works, which can account for 40% of cement and concrete and 25% of steel nationally. So the government purchases a lot for bridges, roads, schools, public housing, office buildings, and so on, hospitals. And this is a huge amount. This is a large share, a quarter of the steel and 40% of cement and concrete being used. And we compare that with the energy area and the CO2 emissions. These are 2 out of the 5 sectors that are accountable for a very large share of the global energy-related CO2 emissions. So particularly steel and cement each are about 7 to 8% of global emissions. So you could say that just looking at this, the public works, so all the works, construction works, infrastructure that government procures globally is responsible for 4.5 to 5% of global CO2 emissions. So we can knock off 1/20 of the global emissions if we just focus on low carbon steel and low carbon cement in public procurement. And then that would have also a major impact on what others are not, the non-government sector is doing in terms of infrastructure and housing related ones. So if I dig a little bit deeper in this, so what's then the deep decarbonization of industry? So I think that traditionally we have the kind of the 4 strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in industry. First one is to try to electrify and then get clean energy, so energy that doesn't carry greenhouse gas emissions, so renewables, hydropower, solar. And then we try to do energy efficiency, so that's using less energy, so then we would also have less energy-related CO2 emissions. Then we have this notion of process emissions, so that is non-energy related emissions that come from some processes that release CO2 or other global warming gases. And then there's the issue of material efficiency and circularity. I think this clean energy and energy efficiency are quite well established, but on the other ones, there are really challenges. And if we look, for example, at cement and steel, particularly, now for cement, about 60% of GHG emissions arise from the calcination reaction. So where we make the clinker, which is the core component, the binding component of cement. So that causes the chemical reaction. The calcination reaction releases CO2, which is the largest share of, say, 60% of GHG emissions. And for steel, it's a kind of a similar situation that 70% of GHG emissions arise from iron ore reduction. So where we turn iron ore into iron metal, then it's CO2 is being released because we do that with coke or with coal as a reducing agent. So particularly, and this is then also why we say that these are hard to abate sectors, because we cannot solve the GHG emissions out of these sectors with just energy efficiency or renewable energy. But I want to also say then something on the fourth component, which is material efficiency and circularity. And that's this report which came out by the resources panel, International Resources Panel 2 years ago. And they say that actually the total contribution of material sector, but they also included plastics and wood, has increased a share of total global emissions from 15% to 23%, or this masked actually a 2.3-fold increase of the greenhouse gas emissions from materials production. So materials are very, very key to solving the climate challenge. And we could even go further. This is then related to material cycle emissions, but also to how much energy is used in the building and related to that. So you look at cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So they did then a further study. So if we look at material efficient homes, and they sort of estimated that, and I think that you look just at the life cycle emissions in these G7 countries, they say that if we just adopt material efficient homes, and this equally applies to offices and infrastructure, other infrastructure projects, then we can say 35% of life cycle emissions can be reduced through material efficiency. And similarly, for in China and India was focused on, it was actually even more, up to 60%. So this actually shows that there is a huge decarbonization opportunity in the design and specification of public works. So how do we design the buildings that we create? How do we design the metro stations that we build? How do we design the bridges and so on? And that can have a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And in that regard, I just refer them to the kind of sustainability or the circularity guidelines for public procurement. But in addition to this kind of material selection and design related ones, there's of course also the issue of what do we do with the materials. And then I think I don't want to go too technical on this audience, but for low carbon steel and cement, for steel, it's basically three options are available. So we continue with using carbon coal as a reducing agent, but that we need carbon capture, use and storage. Or we can try to replace with green hydrogen. So that's hydrogen produced with renewable energy. So we need a lot of renewable energy to electrolyze water, and then we have hydrogen to replace carbon. Or we can go to direct electrolysis as a future technologies. None of those is really proven in the current situation. For cement, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to have different combinations of options to have a low emission energy, so we can use biomass or other fuels. We can use waste as a fuel. We need to look at how much clinker is used in cement and how much cement is used in concrete. So that has to do very much with quality standards. So we can do CO2 capture in built environment, more efficient use of concrete in buildings, and circular economy solutions, which I just referred to. But essentially what it is here is that there is a huge opportunity also to specify materials, to specify low carbon materials in building projects or in public works. But the challenge, of course, is that this requires transformative change because these technologies largely don't exist, have high cost and high technology risk and non-existing markets. So we need to do something in public procurement to create a market so that these transitions can happen. So that's the thrust of what basically under the Clean Energy Ministerial was launched by the 5 countries here on the slide, including India, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. And it aims then to create a thriving market for near zero carbon industrial materials, starting with steel, cement, and concrete. And it has basically 3 pathways. So building the foundations to create a market. So we need a market foundation, so market working for clean and green cement and so on, so that there's a reliability on the data. Then we need to empower governments to buy these materials and use them in their public works. And then we need to also encourage governments to disclose and reduce. And this links very much to a presentation by Ben that he said about the data being utilized there. So very briefly, because I don't want to take too much time, so 3 pathways to achieve is to then look at the global standards for near carbon neutral cement, to look at the standard environmental reporting procedure framework and an evaluation process so that we can really see that this bridge is being built with low carbon cement and it's accountable these and these standards. Then it's a bit about the green public procurement. So we've already talked about the opportunity, and there's some pathways that we could say. So how could we get green public procurement for steel and cement sectors really working? By who's responsible? What are the targets? What are the environmental impact quantification? What are the evaluation tools? How can we monitor and evaluate, and then adjusting policies and getting it as a process? So I think sustainable public procurement is a process that needs to be continuously evolving and improving to deliver better environmental and social outcomes. And then the third pathway is then to look at the encouraging governments, and there the first ambition level is to achieve disclosure, so that governments begin to disclose the embodied carbon emissions from the public works. And some of the countries like the Netherlands is already working on that on some issues. And then by 2050, we look at net zero embodied carbon emissions in public construction. And we could also look for an ambition level 3. So that is a little bit of the background of this, which was officially launched at the COP26 in November in Glasgow. So only initial consultations have taken place in India. So we're looking at the developing countries to set up task forces to look at this industrial decarbonization initiative. So maybe in closing, I can make a few quick points. To say that sustainable public procurement has really become accepted over the past 2 decades and embedded in growing numbers of countries. And Shelley was reporting a different framework, so it's not necessarily as efficient as it should be. And it's starting to make a difference in reducing the environmental and social impact from government activities and public works. But I think as a catch, it remains relatively narrowly focused on a select group of consumer goods with well-developed sustainability alternatives like IT equipment, AC, paper, cleaning, transport. And you would not necessarily say that there is a really transformative power in that procurement. So if I would have to wrap up in 30 seconds what I've been talking about, is that I would argue that we need to look more strategically at sustainable public procurement to scale up the impact of the sustainable public procurement. So not only the environmental impact reduction on the things that government does, but how does that impact then on the sustainability practices of consumers, of businesses and other organizations of agriculture. So that is more seeing on how this can be instrumental in a market transformation for clean tech innovation and startup ecosystems. So connect this public procurement with the startup systems and encouraging new innovators, new developments to come in and to see examples there, and to also then look at how this public procurement can create a market demand that would trigger the investments in sector deep decarbonization transitions in the hard to abate sectors. So with that, I basically close. There is some further more information, but let me stop sharing. And take over the role of a delayed chair. So that's maybe not necessarily there, but I think, or I can give back to the master of ceremony. You are standing there, so maybe you make some comments, and then I can take some questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. We could just take a concluding note from you and then maybe proceed to a question answer session. Would that be fine?
Yeah. Yes, so I was unfortunately could not hear the first speaker, so I apologize for that. But I think the second speaker, Ben Friends, was really highlighting on the power of data, if I may say so, to monitor public procurement and to see public procurement and link that to publicly available data on social and environmental impacts, on health, on other issues, and sort of overlaying what is government's expenditure to what we see as a social and socioeconomic developments, as the environmental initiatives that are taking place, and that is a huge opportunity there. But I think and that would maybe also be a question which I would like to ask then. So how do you see that then also in a proactive way? So how can we then make this information also very much instrumental in selecting forward-looking? So public procurers are always looking for what should I buy, A or B, and how can that be connected there? I think Shelley, you gave a very good account of basically already nearly 3 decades of a sustainable public procurement in one way or another in India, which is quite interesting. I think that the success of the MSE procurement has been quite good, but I think for the international audience, we maybe have to say that a small enterprise can be quite big in India. So a small enterprise goes up to 50 crores turnover. So that's about $7 million turnover. So it's not quite in the international, that would already be quite large businesses. But on the other hand, you say, if I get the figures right, is about 1/3 of government procurement is from micro and small enterprises, which is quite a good figure. And then they have also made commitments that any procurement under certain up to a certain size cannot be tendered internationally to also make that. But I guess that also what you were saying, that some of the schemes are highly underutilized, and the money and financing that's available for ZEB, I think you mentioned 5-6% is really testimony that the pickup of this, the pace of the mechanisms created are not yet there. I mean, myself, I don't have to repeat myself in saying that I would argue in favor of a more strategic approach to sustainable public procurement. So to see that it's not only about greening up what government does, but how can government spending also be mobilized to give incentives to startups, to clean tech innovators, to large companies to transform their industry. So becoming a leading buyer and having those market mechanisms beyond just the public procurement component. But I think overall this is a very interesting topic. I mean, I would give it over to the moderator to take maybe first some questions from the floor, and then there's also some questions online being posed. So maybe questions from the floor first.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, the chairperson of the session, for wonderfully concluding. We're going to the floor now to ask if there is any question from the floor. Any questions from Lalit? I'm afraid there are none, so we can actually take the virtual questions.
Yeah, so one of the virtual questions is dealing, of course, with the issue of the procurement, sort of specifying that we have to go to the lowest priced offer to take that. So what is some of the perspectives of overcoming this in the context of sustainable public procurement? So anybody on the panel, Giuseppina or Shelly or Ben, what is your view on this, on how to overcome this always drive, we need to buy the cheapest?
I can start.
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
We avoid the lowest price now, so we are more to take the advantageous tender, so the most economically advantageous tender. So when we use the lowest price, we fix the basic environment requirement, so all the ones have to comply with them. So we close the tender by mandatory requirements, green requirements, considering the higher price sometimes.
Yes. Shelly or Ben, you want to add to that? Shelly, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what my previous speaker also said, that yes, one of the things is that governments can fix certain environmental criteria beforehand, and then like maybe take the L1 approach of the lowest cost. And we have some examples in India itself, like, you know, during our study when we did our consultation, we were cited this example of the Delhi Metro line coach, wherein, you know, the government deviated from the typical L1 approach of taking just the lowest cost, but rather used a more like longer payback periods, you know, had the operation of the coach been more energy efficient, so what kind of cost savings could be achieved. So yes, but you know, I mean, in the long term, I mean, one of the most firm way of approaching this is to fix certain environmental criteria and have that, you know, give it a sort of regulatory teeth, you know. So I think that intervention from the state is also very important.
Yes. Ben, you want to come in?
Yes, I can just add very quickly. I think my colleagues have already touched on the point, but I absolutely agree. I think the key thing is really to price for improvements, whatever those improvements are that you want to see, whether it's decarbonization or other kind of social or environmental impact. It's really making sure that they're priced for and actually stipulated in tenders as a deliverable, because otherwise it's not going to be delivered. We've seen, for example, with the Qatar World Cup. In the last 10 years or so, as they wanted to build like the greenest games or the best games or whatever it was, there was a lot of work and a lot of good thinking going in there, particularly for those infrastructure projects, to make it sustainable, to make it green, to make it environmentally friendly. But in the end, there wasn't a budget for it and no one was able to pay for it. So then, the responsibility gets shifted further down the supply chain. And so the buck is being passed, to the main contractors, to subcontractors, and therefore it never actually gets built. And so the real trick is, as both Giuseppina and Shali has said, is really to make sure that the improvements that you want to see are actually priced for and explicitly included in the procurement process. So absolutely agree with that.
Yes. Yeah, so I think it's short. We have to make sure that if you don't meet the environmental criteria, you're not considered eligible. So you don't qualify, and then you might be cheap, but you don't qualify. I think the other component which I could add, maybe the dimension, is to look at how the procurement is being done. So if it's done as build, operate, and transfer arrangement one way or another, then some of the life cycle costing could be done. So you operate this, for example, metro line or whatever else, for a period of time, 5 years or 20 years, and then the contractor can actually incorporate more the life cycle cost into consideration, because it would be able to reap the environmental the cost benefits out of that. So that's very good. Maybe Ben, may I come back with my question? That was a little bit more on the proactive use of the big data that you were talking about, because you can see this procurement has happened, and we can connect that with social environmental indicators. But how can this also be done in a proactive steering way? I'm a procurer for the Ministry of Housing, and now I need to build so many houses. So how can I utilize some of these tools or the big data that you're referring to?
That's a really great question, Renee, and that's something that we encourage, so that the use of data shouldn't just be retroactive, right? It should be, as you said, proactive. So really thinking from the start of your process, what is the goal that you want to achieve, and then thinking about how you can make the data work for you. And we're seeing that in some of the examples that I showed. So in India, for example, where they're looking at flood data, they're looking at socioeconomic data and vulnerability data, and then looking at past procurement plans to see where the investment has gone. And that tool that's now being developed is really to help the government decision makers, particularly in the state of Assam, to identify what needs to be procured. So identify where the gaps are, where there's been less spending, but greater need, either in terms of flood propensity or intensity or social vulnerability. And then from there, they can channel the procurement to those areas that need the most. We see that in Malaysia as well, where they were looking at capacity of schools and hospitals and population demographics. So looking at things like not just the number of people living in the area, but how far they have to travel to schools and hospitals, looking at past investment as well. So then again, you can then see those areas that are underserved, so that in the new budget cycle, you can then make sure to target the investment in those right places. So that's kind of like the key. That's the starting point, to really use the data to understand where the gaps are, where the weaknesses are, and then join it up with other data sets so that you can get more intelligence from it to then inform the way that your procurement is done. So that's really the key thing. And I think the other thing that I'll say on that is that we talk a lot about data, and data is great, but obviously data is just the starting point, right? It's really thinking about how, as I said, that you can make data work for you, and how you can also improve that data by sourcing in additional data sets, right? Either from existing data sets or from other stakeholders. So whether it's your beneficiaries, whether it's your businesses. So in Mexico, for example, we did a lot of work there on the bike share system. And a lot of the work there is in the pre-tender stages. So looking at the consultation stage with local businesses, so that you can understand what fits within the realms of possibility, and actually look at what potential innovations you can include into your tender processes so that it becomes a very inclusive and participatory approach so that everybody benefits and it's not just sitting in silos and making decisions on your own.
Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So you speak more in terms of where should the interventions be targeted and so on. So where flood prevention should be done, and not necessarily who is then to supply this, and whether it's company A or B or product A or B. But that's very useful. Shaylee, I had one question came up from that you spoke about India, and it seems to be that there is not very clear roadmap for sustainable public procurement. So there's different initiatives which have come back and have a history of almost 30 years, but it seems like there's a little bit of lacking consistency. So what's your hinge on why this is happening, and do you see any initiatives to bring this a more focused and more concerted action on sustainable public procurement?
Yeah, thank you so much, Renee. One of the reasons, I do feel generally, and this is not just for sustainable public procurement, and sustainable public procurement is a very important means to mainstream sustainable development and economic policy or economic decision making. But the fact remains that, and this is not just only for India, but for many other countries as well, that there is a silos approach to government thinking. The Ministry of Finance, which is going to be, unless and until there's ownership with the Ministry of Finance, the Environment Ministry can talk about it, but then there's not going to be a clear action map which can be taken up by other ministries. This directive has to come very clearly from the Ministry of Finance. But on the other side, on the more, I would like to be more optimistic, because the Ministry of Finance has constituted a task force and has begun to engage with the stakeholders. Of course, the pandemic process, etc., slowed this down, but I would be more optimistic about it for future. Quite apart from this, at the state level, we see more innovations. At the local level, we see more innovations. For example, for us, we are working with the state of Bihar on green budgeting. I mean, this is a typical example of, how if the Ministry of Finance takes ownership, there can be so much more even, done by other departments and other stakeholders. So I definitely think, and this is not just for India, but one can say for many other countries as well, is that once the Ministry of Finance or the finance stakeholder takes a greater ownership, then one can have a roadmap which is going to be adopted by other ministries, departments, and stakeholders.
Yeah. Thank you, Shelley. So you're not seeing this in the so much specifically to sustainable procurement, but you more see it in the context of also in other areas observed that interagency, interministerial cooperation is very difficult, and unless there is one of the really key leading ministries driving the agenda very firmly, it just doesn't happen. And it's whether it's sustainable public procurement or many other areas as well. So that's good. Thank you for that. I mean, I have one more question, if we can allow for another 2 minutes, and then maybe I can go to Giuseppina. There's some questions on how can we incentivize organizations to just adopt then the green procurement, as there would be obviously an upfront investment. It is an additional, perceived as an additional burden that one has to specify the sustainability criteria and then check on those. So what is your recommendation on how we can get over this initial hurdle?
A lot of teaching, because now we have the mandatory GPP in Italy, but public administration and enterprise sometimes they are not ready. They don't understand because it's very, very technical sometimes. They have to understand the criteria, use them, and verify them in the execution of the contract. So, for example, we can give all GPP criteria in tenders, but if the public administration, they use the contract, then don't control, it's not so very important thing to do. So I think the first step is to teach to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So teaching, capacity building, and then maybe
Yes,
what
yes.
one could say is also
before to start, because it's important to give mandatory elements, no, for public authorities, but it's important to give them the instruments to do that.
Yeah.
So
So
before.
Yeah, so that's the capacity building, and maybe also some of the
Yes.
information tools, I guess, that not everybody has to.
Yes,
we
because
can't expect.
people is making GPP and people is applying GPP, so everyone is to us.
Yes.
Everything
And we should also not create the expectation that every procurer then has to become an environmental, social, or sustainability expert. It should be like they can also not be expert on all the products that they buy. So there should be some reliable reference points or data points on which we can build and then add that. So that's fine. Thank you very much.
There are central bodies, no, for contracting authorities, because in Italy, for example, we have 35,000 of public contracting authorities. It's very hard for them, for a small municipality, to understand environmental criteria and
yes. Okay, thank you very much. I think it's 6:06, so that's a nice time. I think we have run over the time, so thank you very much, Ben, Giuseppina, and Charlie, for your inputs. It was very much enjoyable to have this conversation. I think sustainable public procurement, or green public procurement, as you want to call it, has to take a more strategic role and more prominent role in driving procurement and driving the transition to sustainable consumption, production, and the low carbon economy. So thank you very much, and I would hand over back to the Master of Ceremony in the Lalit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rene.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rene, for wonderfully concluding the session. I also extend a heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers in the session.